Picture this: a narrow, cobblestone street in 1665 London. Bodies pile up faster than carts can haul them away. The air reeks of rotting flesh and desperation. And walking through this nightmare, calm as a Sunday stroll, comes a figure that looks like death itself. A long black cloak, a wide-brimmed hat, and a mask with a curved beak that stretches 6 inches from the face. This is the Plague Doctor. And somehow, while everyone around him is dying by the thousands, he walks among the infected day after day and survives. So how did medieval plague doctors treat the dying without catching the plague themselves? The answer is going to blow your mind because it involves some of the strangest medical logic in history, accidental genius, and a costume that actually worked for reasons nobody understood at the time. Let's get one thing straight right away. Plague doctors had no idea what they were doing. None. Zero. They didn't understand germs. They didn't know about bacteria. They thought disease spread through bad air, something they called miasma. Rotting smells, foul vapors, the stench of death. That's what they believed was killing people. And based on that completely wrong theory, they built a survival system that somehow kept many of them alive. We're talking about accidental protection that worked despite being based on total nonsense. But here's the kicker. Modern analysis of their methods reveals they stumbled onto strategies that align shockingly well with actual disease transmission science. It's like they guessed the right answer on a test without knowing how to do the math. The iconic Plague Doctor outfit wasn't just for show. Every single piece served a calculated purpose. Start with that terrifying beak mask. It wasn't a fashion statement or some morbid symbolism. That beak was a primitive air filter packed with over 50 different aromatic substances. Dried flowers, rose petals, camphor, cloves, laudanum, myrrh, and storax. The mixture varied by region and personal recipe, but the goal was always the same: overwhelm the bad air with good smells. Plague doctors genuinely believed that if they could smell strong, pleasant scents instead of death, the miasma couldn't reach them. Sounds ridiculous, right? Except here's what nobody realized until centuries later. That beak created 6 inches of physical distance between the doctor's nose and mouth and the patient's body. 6 inches that dramatically reduced direct droplet transmission. The plague, caused by Yersinia pestis bacteria, spreads primarily through flea bites, but it also has a pneumonic form that spreads through respiratory droplets when infected people cough. That beak mask, designed to filter bad smells, was accidentally creating a barrier against airborne transmission. The herbs did absolutely nothing medically. But the distance? That saved lives. Now the rest of the costume gets even more interesting. The long black overcoat wasn't just dramatic. It was made of waxed leather or heavy canvas coated in suet, which is animal fat. Plague doctors believed this created a smooth surface that miasma couldn't cling to. In reality, they were creating a barrier that fleas, the actual plague vectors, couldn't easily penetrate. Fleas that jumped from infected patients or rats would hit that slick surface and slide right off, instead of burrowing into fabric and hitching a ride home. The gloves extended past the wrists and were also treated with wax or oils. Same principle. Keep the bad air away, but actually keeping the fleas away. The wide-brimmed hat served as another physical barrier and also indicated professional status, so people would spot the doctor from a distance. And those glass goggles built into the mask, supposedly to protect the eyes from evil vapors, actually protecting mucous membranes from droplet exposure. Every single element of this costume was designed for the wrong reasons, but worked for the right ones. But wearing the suit was just the beginning. Plague doctors had strict protocols for how they interacted with patients, and this is where things get absolutely wild. They carried long wooden canes, sometimes called plague sticks. These weren't weapons. They were examination tools. Doctors would use the cane to lift blankets, move clothing, point at symptoms, even take pulses by pressing the stick against a patient's wrist. Why? Because they believed physical contact would expose them to concentrated miasma. In truth, they were practicing social distancing 400 years before it had a name. By maintaining that physical gap, they reduced direct contact with fleas, with bodily fluids, with any contaminated material. The cane also served another purpose. It let doctors give instructions and direct family members without getting close. They could point to where medicine should be placed, where bodies should be moved, how rooms should be cleaned, all from a safe distance. Here's something that'll really mess with your head. Plague doctors almost never touched patients with their bare hands. When they absolutely had to make contact, they'd soak their gloves in vinegar first. Vinegar. They thought it purified the air and neutralized miasma. It doesn't do that. But you know what vinegar is? Acetic acid. And acetic acid has mild antimicrobial properties. Not enough to kill Yersinia pestis directly, but enough to reduce bacterial load on surfaces. Plague doctors were accidentally sterilizing their gloves before patient contact. They had no concept of germs, but they were practicing a primitive form of antiseptic technique. The same logic applied to their treatment rooms. They'd burn sulfur and other strong-smelling substances to cleanse the air. Sulfur smoke doesn't kill miasma because miasma doesn't exist. But sulfur dioxide is toxic to many insects, including fleas. By fumigating spaces, plague doctors were killing the actual disease vectors without knowing it. Now let's talk about what happened after a doctor finished seeing patients, because this is where the survival strategy gets really sophisticated. Plague doctors didn't go straight home. They had decontamination routines that would make a modern hazmat team proud. First, they'd strip off the entire costume in a designated area, usually outdoors or in a separate building. The outfit would be hung in direct sunlight and sometimes fumigated with more burning herbs. Sunlight, they believed, helped disperse bad air. Actually, UV radiation from sunlight kills bacteria. Then they'd wash thoroughly with vinegar or sometimes wine, which they thought cleansed the skin of miasmic residue. Really, they were removing any bacteria or flea debris. Some doctors would even shave their entire bodies regularly, believing hair trapped evil vapors. In reality, they were eliminating places where fleas could hide. After washing, they'd put on completely fresh clothing that had been stored away from the contaminated gear. They understood cross-contamination without understanding contamination itself. But even with all these precautions, plague doctors still died. Not as often as you'd think, but it happened. Modern estimates suggest plague doctor mortality rates were somewhere between 10 and 20% during major outbreaks, compared to 40 to 60% for the general population in infected areas. That's a massive difference. What made some doctors survive while others didn't? The answer comes down to consistency and discipline. Doctors who got lazy, who skipped steps, who reused contaminated clothing, who touched patients directly because they were in a hurry, those doctors died. The ones who followed every single protocol religiously, who treated the costume and the procedures like sacred law, those were the ones who lived. It wasn't magic. It was systematic adherence to a protective routine that worked despite being based on incorrect science. Here's where it gets even stranger. Plague doctors weren't actually treating the plague successfully. They couldn't. They had no effective medicine, no antibiotics, no real understanding of the disease. Most of their treatments were useless or actively harmful. They'd lance buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that are the plague's signature symptom, and drain the pus. Sometimes this helped by reducing bacterial load, but often it just caused secondary infections. They'd prescribe herbal mixtures, mercury compounds, bloodletting, all kinds of remedies that did nothing. Some doctors would place live frogs or leeches on the buboes, believing they'd draw out the poison. Others would make patients drink arsenic or ground up emeralds. None of it worked. The plague had a mortality rate of 60 to 90%, depending on the type, and doctors couldn't change that. So if they couldn't cure anyone, what were they actually doing? Plague doctors served a completely different function that had nothing to do with healing. They were documentarians, public health officials, and psychological support. Their real job was recording deaths, verifying plague cases, enforcing quarantines, and providing comfort to the dying. They document who died, where, when, and what their symptoms were. This data helped cities track outbreaks and predict where the disease would spread next. They'd officially certify deaths so families could settle estates, and authorities could organize body removal. They'd mark infected houses with red crosses so people knew to stay away. And critically, they'd ensure the dying weren't completely alone. In a time when fear drove everyone away, when families abandoned infected relatives, when priests refused last rites, plague doctors would sit with the dying. They'd hold their hands with gloved fingers. They'd speak words of comfort through that beaked mask. They'd bear witness. That was the job. Not healing. Presence. The psychological impact of the plague doctor's appearance was itself a tool. That terrifying costume wasn't just protective gear, it was a symbol. When people saw the beaked figure walking down the street, they knew the plague was real. It was here, and it was serious. The costume commanded respect and fear in equal measure. It made people follow quarantine orders. It made them take precautions. It reminded everyone that death was walking among them. Some historians argue the costume was deliberately designed to be frightening, to serve as a walking warning. Others think the fear was an unintended side effect. Either way, it worked. The plague doctor became the face of the epidemic, a reminder that this wasn't something you could ignore or pretend away. Different cities had different approaches to plague doctors. In Italy, they were municipal employees hired by city councils. Venice paid them generous salaries because nobody wanted the job. Rome required them to live in isolation between outbreaks. In France, they were often second-rate physicians, the ones who couldn't build successful private practices, desperate enough to take the risk for steady pay. In England, especially during the Great Plague of London in 1665, they were a mix of trained doctors and complete charlatans who'd put on the costume and claim expertise they didn't have. Some cities required certification. Others would hire anyone willing to wear the suit. The quality varied wildly, but the costume remained consistent. That became the universal symbol. Here's something most people don't know. The classic plague doctor outfit we picture today, with the beaked mask and long coat, wasn't invented until 1619. A French physician named Charles Delorme designed it for King Louis XIII's court. Before that, plague doctors wore various protective gear, but nothing standardized. Delorme's design became the template because it worked. Cities across Europe adopted it. By the time the Great Plague hit London in 1665, the costume was everywhere. But that means the Black Death of 1347 to 1353, the big one that killed a third of Europe, happened without plague doctors as we know them. Those physicians had no special protection at all. They died in massive numbers. The survival strategies we're talking about only developed after centuries of trial and error, after countless doctors died figuring out what worked. Modern medical historians studying plague doctor records have found something fascinating. Doctors who survived multiple outbreaks developed increasingly elaborate personal rituals. One Venetian doctor documented washing his entire costume in wine before and after every house call. Another French physician recorded burning his gloves after each patient and keeping 12 pairs in rotation. A German doctor wrote about never eating or drinking within 4 hours of seeing infected patients, believing his body needed time to expel any absorbed miasma. These personal additions to the standard protocols suggest doctors were experimenting, trying to optimize their survival. And the ones who survived longest tended to be the ones with the most extreme precautions. The lesson was clear. You couldn't be too careful. The economics of plague doctoring were brutal. Cities would pay well, sometimes 10 times a normal physician's salary, but the job came with severe restrictions. Doctors often had to live apart from their families. They couldn't treat non-plague patients. They were socially isolated because everyone feared them as vectors of disease. Some cities required plague doctors to mark their homes so people could avoid them. Others made them live in designated plague houses. After an outbreak ended, many doctors found their practices destroyed. Patients didn't want to see someone associated with death. Some former plague doctors had to leave their cities entirely and start over somewhere else. The money was good, but the cost was everything else. Yet some doctors volunteered, not for money, but because they believed it was their duty. Medical ethics in the medieval and early modern period included the concept of obligation during epidemics. Physicians who'd taken oaths felt they couldn't abandon the sick even when the disease was fatal. Letters and journals from plague doctors reveal this tension. Fear versus duty. Survival instinct versus professional responsibility. Some wrote about praying before every house call, certain they wouldn't return. Others wrote with almost fatalistic acceptance, believing God would protect them if it was His will. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine watching hundreds of people die, knowing you can't save them, knowing you might be next, and still putting on that suit every morning. The plague doctor's toolkit contained items that seem bizarre today, but made perfect sense in their framework. They carried sponges soaked in vinegar to hold under the nose when smells got overwhelming. They had small vials of strong perfumes to refresh the beak's aromatics. They brought mercury compounds and arsenic powders as medicines. They had lancets for cutting buboes. They carried prayer books because spiritual comfort was part of the job. And they always had a wooden stick, that crucial distance-keeping tool. Some doctors added their own innovations. One Italian physician carried a small bell to warn people he was approaching so they could clear the street. Another kept detailed sketches of symptoms to compare cases. These weren't just doctors. They were plague specialists developing expertise nobody wanted. Here's the really mind-bending part. Plague doctors were practicing evidence-based medicine without knowing it. They noticed that certain behaviors correlated with survival. keeping distance, washing frequently, changing clothes, avoiding direct contact, fumigating spaces. They didn't understand the mechanism, but they could see the pattern. Doctors who did these things lived longer, so they did more of them. This is empirical reasoning. This is the scientific method in its most basic form. Observe, hypothesize, test, repeat. They had the wrong hypothesis, miasma theory, but they were testing it rigorously and refining their practices based on results. In a weird way, plague doctors were better scientists than many of their contemporaries who relied purely on ancient texts and tradition. The decline of plague doctors came not from better understanding of disease, but from the plague itself becoming less common. By the early 1700s, major plague outbreaks in Europe had mostly stopped. Historians still debate why. Better sanitation, changes in rat populations, evolution of the bacteria, climate shifts, all probably played roles. As the plague faded, so did the need for plague doctors. The costume disappeared. The profession ended. But the image remained, burned into European cultural memory as a symbol of epidemic disease and the people who faced it. Modern epidemiologists studying plague doctor methods have reached a surprising conclusion. If you stripped away the miasma theory and replaced it with germ theory, the plague doctor's approach was remarkably sound. Physical barriers, distance maintenance, decontamination procedures, protective equipment, systematic protocols. These are exactly what we do today for infectious disease. The plague doctor costume is basically a primitive hazmat suit. The cane is social distancing. The vinegar washing is antiseptic technique. The fumigation is vector control. They had all the right pieces. They just had the wrong explanation for why the pieces worked. And that wrong explanation was enough to save lives. So how did medieval plague doctors treat the dying without getting infected themselves? They didn't treat anyone successfully. They couldn't. But they survived by accidentally implementing infection control measures that worked despite being based on completely incorrect medical theory. They created physical barriers with waxed leather and beaked masks. They maintained distance with wooden canes. They practiced primitive decontamination with vinegar and fumigation. They followed strict protocols with religious discipline. They understood through observation and experience that certain behaviors kept them alive, even if they didn't understand why. The plague doctor's survival wasn't about medicine. It was about process, about systems, about taking a wrong idea and following it so carefully that you stumble into doing the right thing anyway. Fighting an epidemic isn't about heroic cures. It's about showing up, following the protocols, maintaining the barriers, and bearing witness to suffering even when you can't stop it. That's what they did. And somehow, against all odds, many of them survived to do it again the next day.